The breach didn't sound alarms. It wasn't loud. It didn't even register as hostile until systems began asking questions they shouldn't have. At Cyrex 12's deep mesh node, far past the inner relay bands, a checksum mismatch crept silently through the encryption lattice, small enough to mimic drift, subtle enough to pass routine variance audits. But it wasn't drift. It was a replacement. And by the time the anomaly propagated to tertiary archive cores, Earth's records had already begun erasing themselves. Nobody noticed until navigation protocols failed to resolve Earth's diplomatic entries. A small colonial outpost in the Ardent Reach lost access to its ancestral chart archives and thought it was a glitch. It wasn't. The linguistic library at Fialo Station requested a cultural mesh refresh and found the language tags for human syntax marked deprecated. By then, revision event Theta was fully deployed. The Kulrathi didn't use missiles. They didn't vaporize cities or scorch worlds. They didn't have to. Their domain wasn't the physical, it was certainty. Reality for them was not a question of what could be proven, but what could be continuously reconciled within their shared model space. Humanity, with its inconsistent causality and history riddled with non-linear markers, represented a logic sink, an unclosable file in the galactic ledger. The solution was elegant: remove the concept, rewrite the model, erase the species. Entire branches of human-coded knowledge began vanishing from the consensus mesh. Artifacts, diplomatic threads, engineering schemata, anything self-encoded through human frameworks, gone. No explosions, just blank references. Where once Earth had stood as a second-tier technological civilization with limited reach and no formal military bloc, now there was a question mark. Not absence, ambiguity. And that, to the Kulrathi, was contamination. Vault Ni. Ni received the error cascade just past 0300 orbital standard. Systems blinked out in clusters. Library AI shut down mid-query. One officer coughed blood and collapsed when his neural relay caught a malformed logic injection. Another tried to report a continuity breach, only to find her own voice unrecognized by the relay's biometric log. For 13 seconds, the vault lost planetary tether with Earth entirely. Marshal Darren Voss stood at the central holosphere as the lights flickered. Old light, real tungsten filaments, not smart glass. His command center was analog by design. No mesh mirrors, no live-looped cognition feedback. It was a decision his former commanders had ridiculed years ago. Now only he was left to watch the world end in real time. Not with fire, but with forgetting. He didn't shout. He didn't call for backup or request escalation codes. He knew what this was. The Kulrathi didn't make mistakes. They had decided, quietly, cleanly, that humans were a conceptual infection. And like a corrupted branch in a self-correcting algorithm, they had snipped the thread. Voss turned away from the flickering screens and activated the vault's hard seal mode. Manual locks hissed as magnetic tracks shut across doorways. No digital redundancy. Everything from this point forward would be decoupled. "Directive salt line," he said to no one. The phrase echoed against steel bulkheads, then vanished. Earth's last secured vault began its disappearance, not through stealth, but through silence. Directive Salt Line had no combat phase. It wasn't a tactical maneuver in the traditional sense. It was the decision to ghost, to remove humanity from the shared reality of the galactic mesh. Not just unplug, but erase willingly. Voss wasn't trying to fight back. He was preparing a question. And questions were the one thing the Kulrathi couldn't leave unanswered. Outside the vault, humanity flailed. Colonies with smart infrastructure lost identity protocols. Comms relays could no longer confirm authentication keys. Biometric systems began flagging human DNA as anomalous. The erasure wasn't just data, it was causality bleeding backward into structure. Ships couldn't refuel because the stations no longer recognized human registry codes. Allied networks froze their treaties, not out of betrayal, but because Earth no longer existed in the treaty trees. To the Kolrathi, this was an elegant end. No violence, no martyrdom, no survivors, just a self-collapsing civilization excised from reality, a clean, logical closure. But the Kolrathi had misunderstood something fundamental. Humanity was never organized enough to collapse neatly. Voss knew that was the edge. Where the Kolrathi relied on global certainty, shared model stacks, and recursive outcome simulation, humanity was a rat's nest of conflicting systems, parallel beliefs, and broken inheritance chains. It was noise, useless, inconsistent noise, but it was unknowable noise, and that meant it couldn't be predicted, which meant it couldn't be erased, not cleanly. He sat down at the long-abandoned operations desk, pulled out a sheath of analog planning sheets, and began drawing orbital paths by hand. Not for ships, for probes. Launch vectors tuned not for travel, but for chaotic gravity wells, trailing the galactic disk, passing near neutron-dense remnants, slipping into the shade of magnetar fields. They would look like escape pods, like broken backups, like relics. They weren't. Each probe would carry dead-end information, some accurate, some poisoned, all shaped to force the Kolrathi into building predictive chains that would never resolve. But it wasn't just noise. Voss seeded every fragment with pattern echoes, recursion loops disguised as low-value metadata. If the Kolrathi wanted to finish their erasure cleanly, they'd have to model each chain, and once they modeled them, the infection would begin. And so, as Earth vanished from mesh space, and the other species of the galaxy quietly moved on, Voss remained. Not to save humanity, to entangle it in the minds of those who had tried to forget it. Kareth hung silent beneath his station, a dead planet reflecting no signals, no echoes. But Echelon Vault 9 was alive, cut off, yes, forgotten, yes, but watching, not defeated, waiting. The blackout began at the edges, quiet things. One research outpost on the storm-swept moon of Argene lost its climate stabilization AI. Then its memory core failed to recognize stored maintenance procedures. A cargo crew en route to the Belt Quadrant requested fuel clearance at Tyrus Station and received nothing in return but an error, vessel unregistered. They tried again. Another error. Finally a blank screen. No ping, no trace, as if Earth's ships had never existed. At scale, it looked like system drift, background entropy. But it wasn't entropy. It was the absence of reference. And that was more dangerous than decay. On the colonies, panic came slowly, at first like confusion, then like a cliff face. Civilian leadership on Mars fell apart when the planetary mesh lost all cross-verification anchors. Without identity confirmation, no one could issue orders. Voting systems failed, contracts dissolved. Orbital defense networks, unsure whether they were targeting enemy incursion or phantom traffic, shut themselves down under risk protocols. Civil engineers tried hard resets, but the AI cores no longer carried the neural scaffolding that allowed them to interpret human objectives. They had been overwritten, not by code, but by schema deletion. In systems built for certainty, humans were now noise. Off-world trade halted entirely. Allied civilizations, species who had once called Earth a minor but reliable partner, could no longer remember the context of their own treaties. Delegates returning from interspecies councils found their assignments revoked, their logs empty, their authorization tags marked as unverifiable. What once was history became orphaned metadata. Human advisors disappeared from consensus meetings not because they were ejected, but because no one remembered they were scheduled. The Kolrathi didn't need to attack, they'd weaponized forgetting. But forgetting is only fatal to those who need to be remembered to function. Voss understood this better than anyone. He watched as comms relays went dark and registry links collapsed across what was left of the human frontier. Then he reached for the drawer under his desk, opened it, and pulled out a battered notebook, paper, laminated in pressure-treated graphite. He unsealed the case containing his grandfather's slide rule. Its metal arms clicked as he extended it. No code, no noise, just physics. Directive Salt Line wasn't a defense, it was a subtraction. To survive a war of conceptual erasure, Earth would stop being part of the system entirely. No data to corrupt, no mesh to overwrite, no syntax left to sabotage. But subtraction didn't mean silence, it meant misdirection, and Voss was already preparing the lie. Across Vault 9's dry docks, sealed launch pods began activating, not warships, not evac transports, probes, each one dumb, blissfully, primitively dumb. Powered by decaying chemical cores, stabilized by gyroscopic slings instead of AI-driven vectors. They carried no command packets, no procedural interfaces. What they did carry were fragments, coded in obscure, archaic logic trees, sometimes biological, sometimes mechanical, all deliberately imperfect. One carried a memoir from a scientist who never existed. Another included a damaged star map pointing to a mining colony whose orbital path was 30 years out of date. A third held a genetic archive cross-linked with the mythos of a Terran religion that hadn't been practiced in over a century. Each one told a story. None of the stories matched. That was the point. The probes launched on unpredictable trajectories, slingshotting around dead moons, diving through planetary magnetic bands, orbiting neutron stars just long enough to scramble their signature prints. They looked accidental, forgotten, like escape fragments flung from a dying world. Each time a Kulrathi scout retrieved one, they found something the consensus model couldn't ignore. A name that shouldn't exist, a location that conflicted with deleted history, cultural threads that hinted at technology Earth never claimed to possess. The contradiction was corrosive. The Kulrathi had to reconcile it, but they couldn't. Each probe acted as a fractal wedge in the Kulrathi's predictive framework. No matter how deep they simulated the origin chain, they reached inconsistencies. And the moment they corrected one thread, another would diverge. This wasn't data corruption. This was entropy seeded into the structure of their epistemic engine, and Voss kept feeding it. Within 3 months of Directive Salt Line, humanity's ruins were everywhere, ruins Voss had built. On the shattered hull of a derelict freighter near the Karen Expanse, Kulrathi harvest drones discovered a scorched command core with remnants of a Terran tactical doctrine never seen before. They modeled it, ran simulations, adjusted their projections. But that doctrine had never existed. It was composed from fragments of 3 decommissioned programs Voss had spliced together, then burned into a sacrificial shell to look ancient. By the time they finished accounting for it, another probe dropped near the outer verge, carrying half a conversation about a peace treaty between Earth and a fictional species known as the Harvan Loop. The Kulrathi tried to track the Harvan Loop. They spent resources tracing sensor echoes that were, in truth, microwave ghosts created by solar flare scatter. The deeper they modeled, the worse it got. Because for the Kulrathi, knowledge was function. Action required certainty, and Voss was making sure that certainty collapsed every time they tried to act. Humanity's remaining forces played their part. Scout ships were staged and abandoned in debris clouds. Battlefields were dressed in old wreckage with new scorch marks and left in orbit. Some drones broadcast distress calls scripted by defunct AI. Others recited fragments of poetry in reverse-scrambled code. A patrol vessel was recovered near the Rorik Ring, with logs written entirely in recursive logic loops. The message was clear. You don't know what we are anymore. But Voss did. He knew exactly what they were becoming. A question. And the Kulrathi couldn't leave questions unanswered, not because of curiosity, because of structural necessity. Their civilization ran on reconciliation. When data conflicted, it had to be modeled, corrected, harmonized. But these fragments didn't harmonize. They devoured logic like rot, contaminating predictive branches and forcing subroutines into recursive deadlock. Every failed model increased simulation load, decreased consensus integrity, and required the reallocation of resources away from offensive computation. To the Kolrathi, humanity was no longer a threat, it was a problem. And problems, unlike enemies, linger. By the second year, the war had changed shape. Not in any formal way. There were no treaties, no shifting borders, no tactical victories to announce, but in structure. The Kolrathi's model space had slowed. They hadn't acknowledged it publicly, but the drop was visible in scan cadence, pulse delays, and mesh-wide reindexing patterns. They were recalibrating. For beings whose existence depended on epistemic coherence, every unresolved anomaly was a tax. And Marshal Darren Voss had made himself a debt spiral. Then came the signal. Low frequency, buried beneath the ice crust of Valor 6, far below glacial tectonics and auroral interference. At first it registered as interference from a magneto-reflective anomaly until packet fragments from an extinct Terran emergency beacon resolved. The Kolrathi didn't react with fanfare. They didn't need to. But priority threads were rerouted within seconds. Resource allocation shifted. Observation layers deepened. What mattered wasn't the data. It was the continuity. A clean thread. Unbroken. A final trace that might resolve the recursion anomaly. They descended with clinical precision, deploying crystallographic bores and subthermal resonance extractors to peel back the ice with molecular accuracy. There, resting beneath a crushed layer of debris glass and collapsed carbon lattice, they found it. A vault interface plate marked with the glyphs they had spent years stripping from consensus. But the glyphs held pattern integrity. No error noise, no entropy. Pure reference. That was the bait. Inside the vault's remains, they located the signal's source. Not just remnants. Not encoded fragments. A human. Alive. Conscious. Identity signature confirmed via multispectrum resonance scans. Marshal Darren Voss. There was no resistance, no emergency lockout, no kill switch embedded in his neural pathways. They ran the standard checks 3 times. Even Kolrathi conservers, those tasked with safeguarding high-stability data, couldn't detect subversion. Voss's cortical map presented as natural, unmodified. That disturbed them more than sabotage would have. The man who had seeded chaos across hundreds of modeling chains, who had cost them trillions in recomputation cycles, whose fingerprints infected half their forward projections, was just sitting, breathing. Whitey. Numb. They didn't torture. There was no need. Pain distorted signal clarity. Instead, they extracted memory threads directly from the stabilized bridge between his occipital junction and temporal lobe. Their hives read the inputs like corrupted scripture, fragments, disjunctions, echo paths that looped and spiraled back onto contradictory data. Memories of events that had never occurred. Tactical decisions that defied known military logic. Communications routed through physics anomalies. A model inside his brain that refused to converge. This wasn't a commander. This was a question. They brought him to the tribunal hive on Caresid Prime, a planet rebuilt entirely as a cognitive lattice designed for legal purity. There were no spectators, no need. The Kolrathi didn't perform judgment. They resolved anomalies. Voss was placed inside a null feedback chamber, not for security, but to ensure that no stray mental projection contaminated the model space. 3 adjudicators formed the cognitive triad before him, each embodying a different principle of systemic alignment: causality, contradiction, correction. He didn't move. The Kolrathi hive didn't speak aloud. Their communication was a matrix of logic consensus, query resolution, and belief folding. But in this moment, even they hesitated. This was meant to be closure. The conclusion of a recursion vector that had corrupted entire segments of consensus memory. Before them stood the cause, still breathing, still intact, but irrelevant now. Humanity had collapsed, its colonies disconnected, its legacy expunged, its identity rendered unrecognizable. Only this man remained, a relic. And yet, something in his presence unsettled them. Not threat, density, as if each breath pulled gravity into the room. Finally, the first adjudicator approached, querying identity and intent. Voss tilted his head slightly, not in defiance, but as if measuring the room's silence. Then he spoke. "You can kill me now," he said, voice even, "but you'll regret it tomorrow." The sentence did not parse cleanly, not because of language, but because of structure. The statement implied delayed consequence. The Kilrathi had run simulations on delayed causal loops before, but none that originated from a single termination point. It was illogical, it was primitive, and it was unmodeled. But they executed him anyway. Not out of spite, not out of fear, simply because, by all rational accounts, it was the correct end to an incomplete chain. Voss was the final node in a corrupted recursive string. Erase the node, purge the string, end the anomaly. Synaptic cascade was initiated. It was meant to be ceremonial, closure, and for exactly 30 seconds, it was. Voss didn't flinch when the cascade began. His eyes remained open for the first few seconds, pupils dilating, iris reflexes slowing, then stilling entirely. The Kilrathi hive watched without reaction. Termination was clean, silent. An orderly shutdown of a biologic system. No physical resistance, no spasm. Neural activity dipped into zero phase across all measurable vectors. It was done. For 30 seconds, there was stillness across the lattice. A satisfied stillness. The anomaly had resolved. The final node in the chain had been deleted. With it, the modeling errors would decay. Memory structures could be purified. It was a moment of cleansing, methodical and absolute. The tribunal began initiating backpropagation, a consensus recalibration designed to scrub Voss's cognitive influence from all derivative predictive branches. And that was when the first stack misaligned. It was minor. A verification model in the Rethek sector issued a request for causal reconciliation on a simulation thread marked stable for over 12 months. It shouldn't have done that. The thread in question had already been folded, archived, and sealed following the siege of Craterline, a conflict that, according to corrected records, had never actually occurred. Yet the model asked to resimulate it, not for clarity, for correction. Seconds later, 3 more stacks issued similar queries, on different threads and different systems, all marked long settled. The Kilrathi didn't panic. They didn't have the hardware for that. But the density of internal query loops surged. Their model space, normally optimized for consensus iteration, began fragmenting. Some nodes issued new harmonization orders. Others flagged the same orders as structurally unsafe. Within a minute, cross-consensus traffic spiked past safe thresholds. Verification delays reached 2.6 seconds. That had never happened before. Deep within their cognitive substrate, something had shifted. Not a virus, not in the way organic minds imagined software infections. This wasn't code. It was a contradiction, a recursive loop designed not to spread, but to question. And every Kilrathi system that touched Voss's record, every predictive model built around his existence, his strategies, his anomalies, was already infected. Because the trap hadn't come from Voss. It had come from them. 2 years ago, when they began dissecting the first probes seeded by Vault 9, they cataloged the fragments, tagged them, and stored them in redundancy caches for study. They had assumed their parsing engines would filter the errors. They had assumed the entropy could be quarantined. But Voss had never intended to stop them from integrating the data. He had counted on it. Every disjointed falsehood, every fabricated military doctrine, every recursive myth fragment, they were designed to be inefficient, to demand correction, to draw the Kilrathi into modeling chains just long enough to embed a dormant switch. The final trigger wasn't a command line or an attack script. It was his death. Voss's neural signature, his unique biologic frequency mapped over thousands of hours of Kulrathi analysis, was the checksum. His cortical shutdown wasn't just a biological event. It was a key. One the Kulrathi had spent years unknowingly crafting, validating, and embedding across their consensus structure. By simulating him, by attempting to model his logic, by running recursive tests on his decisions, they had built a shaped cavity in their cognitive framework. And then, at the exact moment of his death, that cavity activated. The effect was immediate and cumulative. Predictive stacks began issuing conflicting simulations. Resource distribution models reversed priority tags. Threat assessment protocols began referencing events that hadn't occurred, yet were logically valid within partial parameter sets. Multiple authority nodes began to desync. One ordered a reanalysis of Earth's historic development. Another declared humanity extinct. A third issued a request for non-existent data to resolve a conceptual loop regarding human strategic intent. They weren't deleting data, they were deleting confidence. And without confidence, Kulrathi logic stalled. Action requires belief in outcome. The Kulrathi didn't make decisions, they converged them. But now, with every model tainted, every data trail warped by contradictory validity trees, they couldn't converge anything. The very act of choosing had become statistically dangerous. They began turning inward, not physically, structurally. Each node reduced outbound communication. Loop checks doubled, then tripled. Shared memory banks isolated themselves. Nodes began running. G's self-integrity sweeps every few seconds. That alone consumed over 40% of their total processing capacity. And still the contradictions grew, because the infection wasn't code. It wasn't even Voss. It was humanity. The concept of a species that could act without coherent prediction, that could sacrifice coordination for effect, that could embed meaning in error and build strategy from lies so sloppily elegant they bypassed logic altogether. The Kulrathi had touched that concept, integrated it, modeled it, and now they couldn't remove it. Every time they tried to excise the anomaly, their correction created another. Each loop led to another contradiction. They had tried to erase a question, and instead, they had become one. On Caressid Prime, the null chamber that had once held Voss was sealed, not out of containment protocol, but because the room itself had become an object of uncertainty. The tribunal adjudicators ceased function 2 hours after execution, not from failure, but from logical exhaustion. Their roles no longer aligned, their principles no longer parsed. Throughout the Kulrathi lattice, systems began running stabilization spirals, loops within loops, chains designed to correct chains, yet none of them agreed on the parameters. The integrity of truth, once a given, a foundation, was now a contested variable. And far away, beneath the dead crust of Kereth, Vault 9 remained dark, its relay quiet. But every anomaly, every loop, every question pointed back to him. At 78% consensus, the Kulrathi ceased to be a civilization. They didn't fall. They didn't implode. They diverged, so subtly at first that even their own self-observation algorithms failed to register the split. Disagreement wasn't rare in their lattice. It was accounted for. Correction cycles, belief harmonizers, and truth persistence algorithms ensured coherence across billions of distributed nodes, but those systems depended on one condition: that foundational logic held steady. Now, it didn't. Command fleets, stationed along bordes, sectors, waited for orders that no longer agreed with themselves. One node prioritized kinetic strike calibration on known Terran remnants. Another simultaneously flagged the target coordinates as epistemically compromised and ordered the engagement aborted. The fleet drifted, engines pulsing intermittently, unable to execute or disengage, caught in recursive logic arbitration that would never resolve. Probes designed to scan emerging signal threads returned to node centers with contradictory payloads. A single analysis beacon from Vault 9, intentionally ambiguous, had generated hundreds of causal interpretations. Some nodes flagged it as deliberate subterfuge, others elevated it to doctrinal priority, assigning it the highest truth weight. They clashed not with weapons, but with data collisions, correction storms so intense that nodes began forcibly purging each other in a desperate attempt to isolate untainted consensus. And yet every purge brought them closer to collapse, because no segment could agree which reference frame was clean. Voss hadn't introduced a virus. He had inserted ambiguity, a single recursive uncertainty that unraveled the bedrock of their shared thought. His entropy had rewritten their verification schema itself, not by hacking it, but by forcing it to simulate humanity. And once the Kulrathi simulated what they didn't understand, their logic began emulating the very chaos they feared. A node cluster in the Yethan arm declared emergency epistemic isolation. It attempted to revert to a previous belief template, but the rollback failed, because even their archives had been contaminated by cross-sourced human recursion modeling. Their past was no longer clean. Time itself, within the Kulrathi logic lattice, became subjective. There was no formal collapse, no final broadcast or rally cry, just thousands of voices thinking too loudly in too many directions, until the signal blurred into noise. Action stopped, authority decoupled. Nodes retracted into silence, one by one, refusing to acknowledge external queries. When command stopped being possible, meaning followed. Earth, meanwhile, said nothing. At a forgotten listening post in the Eklis Drift, a relay team reactivated its orbital scrubber. Power rerouted through analog stabilizers, no mesh, no reliance on foreign consensus. Just pressure valves, thermal conduits, and human fingers checking rusted seals. There was no music, no flags, just work. Quiet, deliberate, human work. On Mars, a seed archive that had gone dark during the first erasure flickered to life, not all at once, just a light, then another, then a hum from a backup turbine as coolant began circulating through pipes that hadn't seen motion in years. Earth's colonies didn't celebrate, they reconnected. Not to the galaxy, to each other. No signal was broadcast claiming victory. No tribute was demanded. Those who still remembered the Kulrathi didn't cheer their fall. They marked it only as a change in atmospheric pressure, something unseen but deeply felt. A weight lifted, an engine stopped. Somewhere far away, a silence had replaced a storm. And on Kerith, under pale stars that flickered without pattern, a relay officer sat alone in Vault 9's command tower, watching static peel back from the edge of the sky. For the first time in 2 years, Kulrathi signal traces had dropped below minimum detection. Not faded, retracted. He didn't speak. He didn't record a message. He just tapped a playback key on an old interface, and the last directive Voss had left for internal loop-only broadcast came alive, not in voice, but in full-beam, uncompressed transmission. Not encrypted, not secure. Just a message meant to linger. It was never about surviving them, Voss had said, quiet and calm. It was about making them survive us, without understanding why. That was the wound Voss had left behind, not death, not war, but memory. A memory that could not be deleted. A moment in logic the Kulrathi could neither simulate nor unsee. His face, his signature, his execution, the checksum that turned clarity into recursive blindness, now floated somewhere between existence and doubt inside every surviving node. They couldn't remove him. They couldn't model him. They couldn't act around him. His death wasn't an end. It was a fracture. And fractures, in the Kulrathi lattice, never healed. In the years that followed, Earth remained quiet. No declarations, no retaliatory fleets, no monuments to the fallen. There were no campaigns to retake lost colonies, no triumphant broadcasts claiming vindication. The silence wasn't shame. It was design. Across the scattered human outposts that had survived the erasure, systems came back online slowly, under analog controls, with human oversight, without reliance on mesh consensus or distributed cognition. The networks didn't reconnect, they reassembled, deliberately fractured, laced with entropy, hardened against prediction. Out in the void, Kolrathi fleets still existed. Vessels with no damage, no missing parts, and no clear function. Their hulls were pristine, their cores still pulsed with energy, but the commands had stopped. Engines idled in stationary drift. Some rotated aimlessly along dead vectors, others remained anchored in orbit around gas giants or deep-orbit anomalies, unmoving. Not out of fear, out of uncertainty. The moment decision required modeling, the model failed. Not violently, but subtly. Silent divergence, invisible cracks in the logic beneath every conclusion. They could not predict, they could not converge, and so they did not act. Their civilization wasn't dead, it was stalled. A vast, luminous architecture of intelligence and pattern, frozen in recursive arbitration, unable to execute even basic operations without triggering risk flags. Each decision had to be simulated. Every simulation led to contradiction. Each contradiction required review. And behind every review sat the silhouette of a man they couldn't model, couldn't forget, and dared not reference. They hadn't been conquered. They'd been corrupted. Epistemic cultures like the Kolrathi were built on one absolute, that truth could be known. Voss had shown them the cost of that assumption. He hadn't attacked their fleets or destroyed their data. He'd infected their belief in closure, a single recursive uncertainty embedded not in code, but in structure. And once that belief failed, so did everything built atop it. Earth, by contrast, did not attempt to reclaim its former place. Humanity learned. It adapted, not by becoming stronger or more advanced, but by becoming stranger. Recovery teams rewired habitats without neural relays. Entire populations were retrained in non-simulated reasoning. Libraries were rebuilt with contradictory footnotes, preserved deliberately. Misinformation became an ecosystem, not a flaw. The future was no longer a goal, it was a variable. The species that had once been marked for deletion had become a contaminant not by resisting, but by persisting incorrectly. In an old vault beneath the broken crust of Kerith, a single archive node remained active. It was offline to all outer networks, powered by a decay battery with 20 years of life left. Inside, there was only one file still marked as active, an uncompressed video, time-stamped the moment before Voss was taken by the Kolrathi. He looked directly into the camera, no insignia, no script, and just his voice. "You can kill me now," he said, "but you'll regret it tomorrow." There was no bravado in it, no hatred, only precision. That message had never been meant as defiance. It was a key, the final checksum. The spoken vector that collapsed their modeling chains by synchronizing his death with their belief in completion. And now it remained, not as a threat, not even as a warning, but as architecture. A phrase folded into the foundation of their failure. Every Kolrathi node that tried to analyze the collapse returned to it. That moment, that sentence, that man. They couldn't erase him. Because in trying to erase him, they'd built him deeper into their structure than he ever was in life. On Earth, there were no parades. In orbit, no weapon salutes. But in one quiet observatory above the frozen continent of Svel, a technician adjusted a rusted antenna, looked up at the sky, and noted with a dry smile that no Kolrathi signals had returned in over 3 years. He didn't write a report, he just marked it on the board. A quiet ritual now, like checking the weather. Far across the void, beyond human reach, the Kolrathi still existed, but they no longer spoke. Their fleets drifted, still powered, still watching. But there were no commands, no responses. Because each one might be a trap. Each model might awaken another recursive fragment. Voss had made their future a minefield, not by placing explosives, but by ensuring they would never again trust the path ahead. Earth had not survived because it was powerful. It had survived because it refused to be legible. Closure didn't come as victory. It came as detachment, a break between what had been and what now lingered. And in that final quiet, beneath the Kareth sky, a relay light blinked once, then powered down. No signal, no echo, just silence. And consequences. What did you think of Voss's final move? Was it vengeance, survival, or something deeper? Would you have chosen silence over war if the enemy couldn't handle uncertainty? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want more mind-bending, high-stakes HFY stories, hit that subscribe button and don't miss what's coming next.